Hello, it's wonderful to see you all here. It's especially wonderful to see you in person and also all of you on Zoom. We're going to move right into our panel discussions. Every year we convene a panel of really interesting people who have taken very different paths in architecture. That's the panel that we have today. To save time, I'm not going to do an introduction of each of our panelists. You have in your handout something about them, and they're going to make their presentations and actually go in sequence without any more from me in between, and then we'll have a discussion. As Rafi said, you can ask questions during the discussion period, either in person in the room here, and if you're in the overflow room, please come into this room if you want to ask a question at the end. Or for those of you who are online, you can write your questions in chat. So our panelists today are Jack Murphy, who is the managing editor of the Architects newspaper, Annya Ramírez-Jiménez, who's a director at Marvel, and Quilian Riano, who's the founder of Design Agency and the interim dean at the Pratt School of Architecture. So without further ado, Jack.
Okay, hi, my name is Jack. Here we are. I'm the managing editor of the Architects newspaper. This is a talk called Paper Architectures because I work at a newspaper about architecture. I'm going to structure the talk in 3 chapters: what I do now, what I've done previously, and why. Who cares, which is generally the most important question. So what I do now, I'll keep it blank for a second. I'm the managing editor. The Architects newspaper is a publication in print and online covering architecture news and criticism. My job is to make sure the issues get produced on time, that text is assigned and returns, that images come in and are laid out. And so my role is kind of the traffic control for the production of a publication. And because it's such a small team, we have 8 people who work in the editorial team, with 2 more in programming who also contribute. I also get to write and from time to time. So if you keep going, the newspaper will turn 19 years old in November. It's notable that it supports both news and criticism. Its audience is practicing architects. It's also entirely free, which is notable as an architecture publication. You can sign up online if you're a student or in the architecture community. It's free for people in architecture and design. These are some recent covers. We make an interiors publication as well. So if the tone of the newspaper is announcements, awards, reviews, criticism, what's happening, the interiors publication has a very different voice, which is about the craft and dedication to interior space that architects regularly perform. The newspaper we make 7 times a year in print, the Interiors magazine twice a year. And we also have these additional publications about products, about case studies where you might want to learn more about more technical things like facades and assemblies and the working bits of how architects actually work on the built environment. And we have an upcoming one about mass timber. You can easily read what we do on the internet. The internet is a very powerful place. And so we have at least 2 full-time editors who write and commission for the website. You can read news here. But I also like the fact that we still make an object, which is a print edition, which again is free for people in the community. Here are some recent pages from it. It's printed on 40-pound paper that's light enough that it's actually a little translucent. And so it arrives in your mailbox. It has a nice big space in it. It's about 11 inches wide by 14 inches tall. And so here are some pages from the July-August issue. This is a feature about the Center for Architecture, review of new books, etc. I'll tell you briefly, if we keep going, generally the sections of the newspapers, you can get a sense of like the train cars in the train that we make every month. We have a cover that has different things on it each time, although some things stay the same. we make news. So in the front of the publication, we have news announcements and things that are going on. Keep going. We have longer pieces, our regular parts of this front of book, we call it. So we send writers to places around the world. We visit offices and studio visits. We look at projects under construction. We have features about important figures and things that might be a little bit more out of time or timeless in terms of content. This is Anthony Fontenot writing. It's an excerpt from his new book about Gregory Ein that came out this summer that we included in the newspaper. At the end, we have a focus section, which is technical and about case studies and products. And then to wrap up the issue, we have reviews, images, and at the back, a comment that generally caps the back page. This is from our September issue, and it's from a writer named Jack Self, and it has the really feel-good title of R.I.P. American Dream. So we produced that quickly. This is the cover of the first issue of the publications from November 2003. And the editors that started the publication had an ambition to have a publication that spoke to what was going on in New York City. It was kind of in the years after 9/11, where a lot of debates and conversations about what was going to happen to the World Trade Center a couple blocks away were going on. And so the publication kind of came into existence to have a place for people to write kind of on their own industry and internally. And while it's kind of grown in scope, I like to think that the irreverence and the ability to be critical is maintained. And so that's something that takes seriously, the role of criticism. And so we can do things like announce buildings being commissioned, but we can also do things like send a writer to a recent protest about the redevelopment of Penn Station. So I'll keep going. What I've done, how did I get here? What happened? Generally, I have been educated as an architect. After an undergraduate degree, I worked in architecture offices. Keep going. Here's a picture of a house that I worked on at a firm called Baldridge Architects in Austin, Texas. At the same time, paired with the very slow speed of design, I wanted things to keep my brain going faster. And so I started writing. It was also a really great way for me to learn how other architects thought. Instead of just being in one incubator of an office, I was able to be in touch with lots of different architects. And at the same time, I was also, next slide, making keep going. Artwork that used language as form. And so the manipulation of language, both for information, for content, and language as form is kind of a separate, that's another topic, but something I'm really interested in. I went to grad school for architecture and did all the things that graduate students do. This is a model I made with my colleague, Shinji Miyajima, actually for a studio project that was sited like 2 blocks from here on Rector Street. I also continued to be involved in the production of publications. So this is Pratt, which is a student journal that is made by students at Rice Architecture I went to school. So I worked on that. Here's some spreads from the issue called Simplicity, which I worked on. I had a thesis project, which was to propose a new department of the federal government called the Department of Wellness. And then I renovated Marcel Breuer's Department of Health and Human Services building in Washington, D.C. As the headquarters for the center. So here's a before scene, here's an after scene where the facade is redone and there's a giant staircase and more trees. But the thing that became difficult about this project is that I was working on it when the pandemic started. And so all of the support apparati or apparatuses of the school were kind of in sequence shut down. And so pretty quickly I had to figure out how to communicate about my project without a model, without drawings in the space of Zoom, which we all know about probably too much now. And so the way that I got through this process was to write a short story and then make images about the project to kind of illustrate the short story. So again, the use of writing as a way to move through design was important. Keep going. That later became finally a book, which enters the archive, and here's a couple of pages from it. And to me, I think the interesting thing was to think, keep going, yep, to think through the different formats of the project. So if we keep going, I was working on it in reality, I in the 3D space of the project, on Zoom, in a PDF, in a book. After that, I worked on a publication called Site, which is produced by the Rice Design Alliance. So I was now moving from an architecture degree into an editorial role, leading a publication produced by the school. Here's a copy, here's another copy, here's the website where we had articles. I worked on this in Houston, so it was the Architecture and Design Review of Houston, and was also able to teach at the University of Houston about how architects use books. So this is a class called Publishing Practices, about book production and knowledge sharing. And then the final most important part, why, who cares? A couple of provocations about why working in the media, quote unquote, is important. The next one, architecture begins and ends on paper. We learn from the library, we make things, over time might return to the library in different ways. And so that loop of knowledge production is, I think, important to recognize in how we learn as students and as people. So here's Pratt kind of re-entering the Rice Library. I think there are a lot of correlations between architecture and print. If we keep going, it's made in teams. There are different specialists that you work with. If we think about relations between print and architecture, you can think about a layout as a plan. It has grids, there are columns, there are gutters. We can think about a publication in sections. So what is the sequence that we see? So sectional thinking is important. And then we can think about it in elevation. The cover, what does it project? What does it say? How do we communicate with our publics? I think the next slide, design is editing and editing is design. It's a process of refinement, of creation, analysis, and recreation, or work again. There's a great line from the Elements of Style that says, a sentence should have no unnecessary words, much like a drawing should have no unnecessary lines, or a machine, no unnecessary parts. And so I think that's important. So as an editor, I work on text with writers. This is an example of how extreme editing can be. This is a short story by Raymond Carver, who was kind of edited into the ground by his editor, Gordon Lish. And so the stories that, 2 volumes of the stories you know from him bear the mark of that editorial relationship. And so I think it's important to think about media as edited all the time. The next piece, architecture exists among forms of media. It's really difficult to locate where it is, what you're actually doing. Is it a building? Is it a model? Is it a drawing? Is it a book? Is it a movie? Is it a story? And so that instability, I think, creates a really ripe terrain for you to work with media in different ways. The classic example that I like to think about is, this is from Towards an Architecture by Le Corbusier, and it turns 100 next year, but you can see in this edition, the picture that appeared on the right in the page, the actual image on the left was airbrushed or photoshopped in our terminology now to reduce the ornament in the back and kind of make the more platonic geometric ideas that the author wanted. So media is always manipulated. I think we know that all too well in the current media landscape that we exist in, largely. And then the kind of last point is that architecture contours the realm of the possible. I see architecture and the production of buildings, it's deeply enmeshed in larger systems of power. Architecture is not frozen music, it's frozen capital. And so the things that get produced enable certain activities and access while denying others. And so I think the politics of that are quite strong and important. And I think that we see the ways that power has moved in our societies encoded into our cities and into the form of the built environment. And so being able to read that and understand it and try to address it is super important work of criticism. I think buildings can become extremely potent objects in the public consciousness. This is an image of a market in Mexico City where you see in the bottom here, a trinket of Museo Sumaya, Fernando Romero's museum, alongside trinkets that are Teotihuacan, and in the back, the Monument to the Revolution and the Torre Latinoamericana. And so the idea that buildings shape consciousness, become icons, and really contour how we understand cities and use cities is really powerful and quite important. So I think we need better symbols, which means we need better architecture, but we need better stories about architecture. And so I think that, to me, that means that I'm excited about this working on a newspaper, because I think the contribution of someone to help shape and tell those stories is supremely important. And so it's for that reason that I'm happy to be here and to be working at a newspaper in 2022. Okay, thank you.
That was very inspiring. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Annya Ramírez-Jiménez. I am from Puerto Rico, and I have a mom and a dad. I'm also shorter than Jack. My journey is not about having a successful and premeditative linear process of how I got there or where I am right now, but rather a collection of experiences that I have so far gone through, which I think that as of today has put me in the path that I finally can call home. I'm from San Juan, Puerto Rico. I went to the University of Puerto Rico to get my bachelor in environmental design, which is very, very nice title without too much weight. Empathy started in my life around 16 years old when a bird fell from a tree, and we nourished him. Pollo was his name, and he lasted 18 years. So at that point, I realized that there was like an environment, a realm of other living animals and living things around us. Fast forward, we're here in New York. I'm still here 19 years later, which coincidentally is the architecture newspaper existence. So I guess good timing.
Good timing.
So I went to Columbia. Some of you are currently enrolled there, perhaps. And when I saw that picture, I realized that my hair has gone a little bit gray. I never had a desire to leave Puerto Rico. And every time I had a break, I went back there to work in an architectural office, to spend time with my family and to be with my friends. But there was always a time to return and then to stick around. So I practiced for about 10 years in a multitude of offices that included a very diverse set of work. I was very lucky to get my work in hospitality and being asked to be part of the design team of the first Tesla flagship, which it was a very odd commission given the fact that we were doing restaurants. But Tesla was looking for something beyond the normal. I also participated in international work at FX Val, which is FX Collab now. worked in 2008. I had the privilege of working in the guidelines for high-speed rail across the nation, which is something that came through the Obama administration, and it had a painful death. But I was very proud of being part of that. None of this really fulfilled me, even though I felt that it was good work and that I was being exposed to and participated in. And I was looking for a way home. Maybe some of you know Marvel Architects, and Marvel Jonathan is Puerto Rican. And I learned that he was trying to join forces with the San Juan office of his father and his office. So I gave him a call. And I joined Marvel. And that allowed me to continue my endless loop of coming back and forth from where I'm from and what really completes me. Part of what I was missing really is the sense of community that comes from belonging to a group. And in 2016, which is when I started at Marvel, we all know what happened during the election. And I was lucky to participate and lead a team from San Juan and New York in building a new neighborhood in Fort Rockaway, which combined a lot of the things that made sense to me, which was to allow others to be part of a larger narrative without having to leave home. At the same time, put into practice a lot of the learning experiences that I'd had previously in larger scale projects and infrastructure. Architecture is a process that you might be familiar with. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that need to be tested and judged. So this project was part of a whole from 0 to 100, in which we discussed with the city how to create a neighborhood and how to really provide enough pieces for it to thrive. Today, the first phase of the project is open now. That picture is for 5 days ago. So it's still going on and it's going to still happen for the next 10 years. Not all stories are full of glamour and joy. There's always a little bit of pain that helps you appreciate where you stand. By making that endless loop possibility during my career, I was able to be in a good place to help be part of the relief efforts and recovery of Hurricane Maria in 2017. So as an office, we were able to organize from New York and in San Juan to give to others what they were lacking, which are things that we take for granted: water and power. We recognize, and I think that New York City is a good example after Sandy, that power is really critical for us to survive. That's why it's so cozy here today and not freezing. And it allows us to survive. So we were part of the efforts of giving power to community centers, and also due to the overwhelming support of many people, we were able to open a not-for-profit called Resilient Power Puerto Rico, which I don't know if you have heard the news, but currently there was a storm called Fiona, and we're kind of back to square one, except that the community hubs that we have been developing through the country, as I like to call it, has withstand the weather conditions and are working to serve their communities. And that work never stops. So this conversation is not only about how I made it back home, but how it allowed me to nourish a feel of community that goes beyond where you're from. This project, Orchard Beach in the Bronx, some of you might be familiar with it. It's a Robert Moses era pavilion that was designed in 1937, or was built then. And surprisingly enough, the Orchard Beach Pavilion is an Orchard Beach is a beach that is frequented by a lot of Latino community and Puerto Ricans. It's almost like a place away from home that makes you remember home. So we are working on that, and it's really a space of a community and to bring back joy and excitement to others and level the playing field in cities that we need so much to enrich ourselves, especially after a pandemic that had us all trapped at home. Remember that bird that I mentioned earlier? I was able to connect another interest of mine, looping everything together with the design of an animal care facility for the city of New York, which is currently going to go into construction at the end of this year. And what that project has become for me and for our team is it has allowed for the stakeholders, the client, the city, even the permitting agencies to have an empathetic connection to things. As we all know, we have been on Zoom, and there has been dogs and cats behind the scenes of every person in a meeting. And again, that gives a humane aspect to what we do. That is not really only about an object that, it serves an aesthetic purpose, but rather is a space that you can find a little bit more about yourself and about your community. Every project, as I pointed out earlier, goes through a process of design and elimination, which you might be familiar in studio with. And some ideas get a little bit more rationalized, but nevertheless, the spirit of the program lives on. Through this project and even slightly before, I have been able to volunteer at several not-for-profits and be part of the board of some of them. One of them is the Welfare Fund, which is located in Upper West Side. And they are the only facility in the city of New York that you can bring a bird to be rehabbed. The Sato Project is a dog rescue that is kind of like me, a little bit in New York and a little bit in Puerto Rico, and brings dogs and other animals to the States to be adopted. But that's not the only thing I'm interested in. I'm also interested in my culture, in the culture of the Latino community and beyond. And I am part of the Clemente Center, which is in the Lower East Side. It is a media space. There's a theater, there's a rehearsal space, there is dance studios, there's a little bit of everything for everyone to be nurtured and enriched, because the art is really one of the things that tied us together. That and food, obviously. And that really allowed me to sort of close another loop in my life, which was, if I was looking for an identity of how to practice with empathy and with more care than just buildings that speak to others, we were able to secure a commission with the Bronx Museum of Arts, which is in the search of an identity that is of the Bronx. And it's not just another museum with a nondescript collection. So that is today, that is the process that I am going through. And if I wanted to close it here, is because you will learn through your career that it's not about getting to a specific place, but rather a continuous process of rediscovering who you are and what is it that you find value in, rather than just going with the flow and doing architecture that might be beautiful, might serve great purpose, but doesn't necessarily speak to you. So I encourage everyone to really look into that as you continue your education in school. I think that is everything for today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. So Quilian Riano, I'm currently the interim dean at Pratt Institute of Architecture, and I wanted to first give kind of a map to some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, and is about the influences of special educational. And I put the Air Force there as an education because I joined when I was 17 years old. So in a way, it was a little bit of a moment of me beginning to learn things, and almost even, quite honestly, a bit of a college experience. I did do an associate's degree in Black Hills State University. Then the current practice is both my own practice and practice of teaching in academia, and the idea that all these things have to become practices. And then 3 organizing structures that I have been a part of that I'm very proud of: Architecture 2030, the Architecture Lobby, and Dark Matter University. Not my personal practice, because not something I do by myself. We'll have to begin to collectivize these ways of working and how all together all these things end up feeding each other. And next, please. This is where I served. This is Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, where I lived for 4 years. And then as I was finishing my military experience, so in the 4th year, I began to work in the Rosebud Reservation, helping build wells with the engineering team, the Red Horse team of the Air Force. At the same time, I had a sociology class with a professor from the American Indian movement. These experiences together made me wonder about the design by which wells were needed. About the things that I was noticing in South Dakota and the larger system. And at the time thinking whether I wanted to go into art or architecture. Next, please. I heard about Marietitsa Potric, Estonian, I believe, architect and artist that at the time was given a solo show in the Guggenheim, where she was putting some of the work that she was doing in Caracas and other places around the world in here. I began that practice inspired me to go into architecture instead of art. Next. I went to University of Florida. My first professor was Bernie Wojciechowski, who had worked with Joseph Albers and his color folio. So it was a little bit of how to bring these experiences and interests that I already had, or things that I had observed, my own experience growing up in Miami, with the formal structures of education, learning color theory as an incredibly important part of diagramming. This is my portfolio from undergrad, where even though it wasn't really part of the syllabus, part of the curriculum, I try to always bring, for example, on the left was a tower next to the UN for a hot dog vendor. Here, this last one was a way in Vicenza in Italy, they had outlawed, made it illegal for immigrants to hang out in parks. So this was an immigrant housing project in a park in Vicenza. So beginning to combine these sets of ideas. Next, please. And then one day, just kind of walking around the library, I noticed this book, Walter Hood's Urban Diaries. Walter Hood, this book began to show me, and for anyone, Rosalie mentioned Walter earlier, but this book began to do 2 things that I hadn't really been seeing too much in my career. Number one is very carefully noticing neighborhoods, in his case, Oakland. And second, using the everyday practices of people to create architectures and landscapes that by their creation had more meaning. Next. I went to Harvard University afterwards for my master's. You see, this is actually not completely in sequence, but I'll share with you in a second. Where to go to Jack's point, I also began to write a lot, and I was an early blogger, and every once in a while I forget that I actually did this, and I make Diana Darling, she reminded me, and it comes up in funny ways, but I had a blog where basically I was just curious about trying to digest the things that I was seeing, both those experiences I've had, the things I was moving forward. Please, next. This is a Chinatown pop-up library, a little bit of an activist project with a big group of students that we did, because Chinatown in Boston was the only neighborhood that did not have a library. So this was a way to bring attention to that, but we used CNC routing, we used the algorithms, we used the whole nine to begin to make these points. Next, please. It's also where I began to experience and work with landscape architects and urban design. I had never really quite done that before. I worked with quite a few of them, including Carl Steinitz, one of the people who learned GIS. And I always like to say this, he would not let us use the tool. He wanted us to do it in trace paper and create layers, because the point was how to ask questions of the tool, not let the tool drive you. Next. My thesis tried to combine architectures, landscapes, urbanisms in Tijuana to create large-scale processes of collecting water, cleaning water, and then providing that to some of the communities that form, especially around factories. Next. Next. So after I left school, one of the things that I still hadn't had enough of that conversation that maybe had started for me in the military, in a funny way, about social justice, about these set of things. I don't think too many people can say that, but I feel like I can. One of the first, the occupation of Wall Street was happening at the time. So I started a collective. I was in a space with a lot of artists, not an alternative, who, if you ever saw the tents, some of you might be a little young for this, but the tents, they were the artists doing some of those things. And we had a group of people, Reverend Billy, that kind of group of artists were all working out of this space. Together, we created a series, I created a collective called Who Owns Space that was looking at the ownership and privatization of public space and what that means for our everyday experience of the city. The thing on the left is a series of diagrams I did with lawyers, Paula Siegel, about how the NYPD was violating the rule around privately owned public spaces that was used by the NC, the Civil Liberties Union to bring down the fences. Next, out of that, an interest on public space and the specific rules by which it's governed began. The Queens Museum gave me a commission to look at Corona Plaza, in North Corona, Queens. I told them I would not design the space, that was not the project, that the project was to design the tools of conversation. I was very much interested at that time in theater of the oppressed, the Chantal Mouffe, and ideas around pluralistic democracies that emphasize negotiation and even productive conflict as a way to have a pluralistic society. So one of the first things we did is what I call lo-fi augmented reality, just plexiglass with diagrams that ask critical questions around public space and just people there in English and Spanish talking to people. Next. Out of that, people told us their interest. We created what I call a game, but really was an activity, a spatial large-scale activity that put some of the potential issues and conflicts into play. Next. In a winter day, people played it for hours. This serving as a way of talking about anxieties, fears, and hopes for this area. Next. What I ended up giving the Department of Transportation, the Queens Museum, was a series of notes like this that kind of began to tease out. So next. And similarly, I've taken this idea of gamifying things as a way, again, of creating negotiation and even small-scale political models. Political here, talking about the negotiations that we do to co-inhabit space. This was in a collaboration with architect Teddy Cruz from San Diego and Simon Boussier, a landscape architect that at the time was at Ball State University. We basically, this is housing that we designed for Nicaragua. One of the first things we did was actually work with the community and create a construction company. We sent a tractor and started a whole construction company that then would have a gravity and a structure, a business structure of its own. And then because there wasn't a really good survey about the trees, we gamified the urban plan. So the top left there is the instructions. I call this the Solduit urban planning, urban design model, in which with a little, very basic set of instructions, people on the ground can make the decisions to create the spaces. Next, the housing itself was we looked at what people were doing. We reconstructed it as a way to create, again, what actually in Latin America is called progressive architecture, meaning architecture that can grow, rooms can grow as families grow. Next. And this is a quick little example. In 2016, a conference of artists looking at the future of the Southwestern city asked me to make a small pavilion, the kind of thing to give you a couple of $1,000 and they're like, do something. So what I decided to do was, this was going to go in East Dallas, I believe, was create something for kids, but I wanted to create a game again that made visible the questions that the conference was asking. So I made a sandbox in which those yellow pieces in the front can be used to negotiate land, and the black thing in the back is a dew catcher and water. So the idea is that's the future of the Southwestern city. How do we negotiate land and water? And something that kids ended up enjoying. Next. Similar structures. This is for a Black and Latino urban farm in Phoenix. One of the interesting things here is that some of the same structures that we're working with in individual communities, a series of nonprofits came together to make this a gigantic, I'm talking about 4 or 5 New York City block farm. They asked me to help them come together both as a series of nonprofits led by the Desert Botanic Garden there, but also to begin to design it in a structure, a basic kind of master planning project and programming. Next. We created systems what you see here is an educational system that the more a farmer learns, the more space they can have. Next, designed a pavilion that would be for community activities as well as using water in strategic ways. Next, and this is what the farm looks like today. Next. The last project I'm going to show of the practice, this is a collaboration with Giancarlo Massanti and Carlos Medellin. And this was a series of spaces that for political conversations inside the Institute of Contemporary Art at the Virginia Commonwealth University. Next. The idea was to create an incredibly flexible space for everything from dancing, as you can see here, but really to have conversations about what it means to be a Commonwealth. Virginia, Puerto Rico, Pennsylvania are all Commonwealths, which is a slightly different structure than a state. So looking at that language and next coming together. So we created a series of things, making the space itself, space of political, can you play the video? Oh no, the video didn't translate, okay. The spaces that would create different spatial conditions and then areas for everything from performance, small private conversations and active community-based conversations. Next. Out of that, I met artist Duran Chavez, who ran the environmental parts of it. And the museum gave him a space to create a urban farm. He's been building, he's basically solving issues in Richmond, Virginia, of food deserts by putting farms. And so together we worked and we created a similar gamified system for him to design next to it. And it's the Black Space Matters. This is the last thing I'll show. This is the project, the Design Tools for Public Space project of the pilot project for creating new spaces under the elevated structure. Next. Okay, it became part of a toolkit that the Department of Transportation uses. The last experience that I've had is that I work at the Community Design Center. I'm gonna tell you that, and we wrote an article or a series of articles for the Architectural League of New York on the Mahoning Valley, an area that was one of the wealthiest places in the US at one point and has lost a lot of its jobs and where it's incredibly politically important. Next. And looking at the potential futures and how to create community-based economic solutions for this using urban design, using architecture. This is something that Kent State and what I started there, we started looking at how economic conditions and cooperatives and collectives can be shaped through architecture and design. Next. Same thing at Lordstown. We had a multi-million-dollar grant with the Department of Labor and Youngstown State University to do some of this work. So the final thing that I want to go through very quickly is the 3 experiences that I think are incredibly part of the practice. Next, I went to New Mexico and started working with Edward Masria in the early 2000s. Next, I started doing buildings sort of like that, but I knew he had written the book on the left, the Passive Solar Energy book, and the importance of books. But then in, I believe, 2003, and that date keeps coming up, he published this very provocative open letter, really, on articles in Metropolis that architects pollute. So Ed next decided to close his firm and started something called Architecture 2030, which was going to be a call and an argument for the rest of architecture to begin to take the climate crisis importantly, and to face that architecture is part of it. I created this tool, the 2030 palette for Architecture 2030. I was the director of this and took the original book and expanded into a series of tools that looked at how does environment work, how does architecture work, where are the nexus, and how can we think about that moving forward. The Architecture Lobby, which is an organization that looks at labor rights within architecture, thinks of architecture as workers, and begins to expand that, as well as research that we've done into how to turn our practice, again, create new political economies that look at cooperative and collective models, not only for architecture, but for the larger society with architects involved in that. And Dark Matter University, which is a BIPOC-led academic network that tries to do these series of things. Next, we have taught courses at Tuskegee. I was able to teach with a group of people and have a constellation of courses in universities all over the country. Next, including a course that I could talk with Jen Lowe, looking at the cooperative futures. Next, with series of networks. And one of the things I like this, and this is another principle that we take very seriously, mentorship, or more, we call it peership, where people of different experience levels work together, really trying to lift each other up and create networks of activity for each studio. So one studio had multiple community partners, had 3 people teaching, had 2 universities linked to it, and that is one of the things that we're postulating as the potential future. I think we can just go to the last one. I'm out of time, so just some of this work that was created out of studios, and one day I'll explain it. But all this now, how it comes together into my current job, the Pratt Institute, and how these different experiences, both honestly, I think my experience in the military and logistics, writing contracts, has been incredibly helpful as I take on the role of interim dean at here. Also organizing and being and having had conversations about what a pluralistic democratic process for change means, really helpful. So the company, basically, I'm ending with this. This is still to be continued, but also how the different experiences you have throughout your career in unexpected ways might help you with whatever steps you move next. Thank you.
So Jack and Annya, Quilian, if you'll join here. So those were 3 totally incredible presentations. Thank you all so much. Quilian, there is one, I'm going to start with a very specific question for you. Despite everything that you showed, it's mind-boggling how much you've accomplished and created. There's one aspect of your career that you didn't mention, which is working in the public sector. I wonder if you just would say a little bit about, and maybe put in context with all of the other things that you've done.
No, that's very true. And actually, I work for the Department of Design and Construction as the lead strategy and urban design person in the office of the chief architect. And I'm going to share with you in 5 seconds. I see it similarly to working with the Community Design Center. It was a desire of how the work that we do can have impact that is bigger than an individual practice, et cetera. And I thought that working within government and helping set guidelines, processes, systems by which multiple buildings, multiple landscapes are created, was the most helpful. And all I'm gonna say is that it's hard. Working with bureaucracies and systems is hard, but it's the future. And just because you and I talked about it very quickly, Rosalie, in the way in, how architecture, how young people I'm seeing change it, is that they're taking these systems more seriously and the opportunities to work within these processes, knowing that it's hard. They're sometimes said, but that there's things to do within them. I find that there's more appetite within younger architects these days for that.
I'm gonna, to that point about us talking about what young people, all of you are young, but what young people are looking for. Hold that thought, because we're gonna come back to that, and I would like to know what you think kind of are the biggest, is a big trend in what younger people are looking for that's different in the profession compared to maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But while you're thinking about that, Jack, you have taken a route, at least temporarily, and you have made a very convincing case for the kind of parallel of the creation of architecture and writing. But I wonder if you miss on a day-to-day basis design. You were working in a design firm, I mean, architectural design in the traditional sense.
So is this still working?
I think so.
Okay. I actually, I think about this a lot because it's true that I've changed fields in a way, or changed sides, if you want to think about coverage of architecture in a dialectic with producing architecture. But the answer is I don't miss moving the lines around at the moment. I still have kind of side projects where I'm able to design things and work in that way. But I think right now I've been really satisfied with this change, and really excited about the possibilities and the type of work. I think there are a lot of different roles and jobs people can have adjacent to the actual production of architecture. And so I think that's exciting as a idea of what a career in architecture supporting improvement of cities and the built environment means. And so I'm happy to have a way that's based on kind of my own person and my experiences to contribute to that in a different way. And so I've been really excited and happy about that change. Yeah.
Annya, you, I think in addition to your project and design work at Marvel, you're also involved in building the culture of the firm around diversity and inclusion. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that aspect of your work.
Sure. So I was one of the founders of our group, our EDI group called Ideal, which is, a riff on the words. Okay, sorry.
It's actually transmitting. It's actually.
Okay, great. So it's called the Ideal Group, and currently I oversee the staff of the office, and what we try to do as much as possible is to ensure that everyone in the office has a voice and not only gets assigned to a project because that's their task, but rather that as much as possible, we try to team up the desires of a staff member with the project. And what I say all the time is that we might not get it right the first time, but if we keep trying it long enough, you're gonna be doing something that means a lot to you. And in turn, that has allowed the practice to have a very high rate of retention. And that obviously means that we're trying something and people are open to it, and we're gonna continue to try it.
All three of you have done a lot of things at the same time, which is not pretty impressive. It's amazingly impressive because, they something that is characteristic or has been characteristic of architecture, hopefully it's changing a bit, but has been just how demanding architecture jobs are. And, not leaving you maybe much free time, but so I wonder if each of you would talk about how you've kind of managed that time aspect of your life in order to have the time to do civic or cultural or educational involvements that are obviously connected to you, but different from your day job, so to speak.
I mean, it takes a lot of time. I think part of the answer is that I feel like it's part of like the life I want to lead with the time that I have and the interest that I have. It kind of takes all of the, you know, the free time out of it. But I think what am I trying to say? I think I made time for those kinds of extra activities, writing being an extra activity previously, and because it served my intellectual curiosity and because I wanted to learn about the world, and that kind of side hustle has now turned into my main hustle. And so I think there are ways that this kind of adjacent interests in your activities, again, interfere and combine to shape a career that you can be happy with and excited about. So, but it is a lot of work.
I think you're onto something.
Okay.
And it's for a long time I tried to capture what I was interested with, what I was doing every day after I wake up, go to the office or meet people. And I think I'm getting closer to where I want to be because now I don't have to think about what I have to do later in the day, but rather I can focus both my not-for-profit work with the work that I do every day. And that actually gives you a purpose to wake up every day with intent. And, you know, sometimes it's not as easy. Sometimes you are depleted of energy, but it is pretty rewarding to see, like, you start to see the effects of what you're doing. And that gives you enough energy to continue to move forward.
So I want to begin by sharing with you that one of the reasons, first of all, I'm just a little bit hyperactive, and I just always was. Like I mentioned, I was in the military and going to school part-time and doing volunteer work and just kind of a little bit. But that there's also a political dimension to this, that not everyone can do it. Like physically, people have sometimes people to take care of. I mean, once I had a kid, a lot of the things I was doing before went out the window, right? And that so many folks experience this, that and the only thing that I'm pointing to is that actually the fact that I'm a veteran and I hadn't had to worry too much about health insurance because I can go to the VA hospital anytime, opened up possibilities when I was straight out of school, where I could just kind of have the practice I wanted with a certain amount of leeway that I do understand that not everyone has. And I'll share that the work, for example, Dark Matter University, as when we all started it went beyond an extra thing that I was doing to like a community, a lifeblood, like probably the thing that helped me the most during the pandemic, that basically went from being kind of what maybe when I left school was side hustles, and I can share with you, all of you, I've taught up to, at one point I was teaching in 4 universities, traveling studios at the same time, while I had 4 major projects all over the country. It was just too much. You can organize it and move it, but I also want to recognize that not everyone is in that place. And I also want to say there's a dimension, right, of like the systems that allow you to even do that kind of thing are different, and everyone is not affected the same way. And to finish that, actually, in the last couple of months, all that practice that I've had in the past has gone out the window because now I just focus on this. And also the work that I do with Architecture League. But that's basically all I'm doing these days.
So before I ask my next question, I encourage you to be ready to ask your questions, both everybody online and all of you here in the audience, because we're eager to hear what you're interested in. So now I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to identify each of you, one, I'm sure there's more than one that each of you could come up with, but what's one really important change going on in architecture right now that maybe is just at the very beginning of change or something that's well underway, but what do you think is significant right now that is changing the field and or is something that young architects are pushing or asking for that's different than before?
I'm the non-academic on this panel, so maybe I can start and you guys can follow. I think that sometimes you see things the way you want to see them, but the fact that people are looking more to unite together and to push an idea as a collective without design education, I think it's something that now it's getting to university level, so education. So students are pursuing the idea of being the ones that have the tools to help others realize their dreams or their goals in a community. And that is something that was not prevalent when I started architecture education, just shy of this millennium. So I do see that is more prevalent, and every time we have people coming to our studio, and when we are juries on project on school, we see a lot of that component, which was there before, but it was not really the driving force in my experience.
I'm just going to completely agree with this because I see the same thing. I think that the multiple crises we face have been only amplified by the health crisis that we have gone through the last 3 years, and that is leading both to a certain amount of soul searching about what we can do. And I think that we as designers, architects, landscape architects, urban planners, urban design, have a lot to contribute to these conversations. It takes some humility and it takes some rethinking of that picture from the very early league meetings. It requires certain rethinkings, but I think I see both energy in what we can say that our fields do. So tons of material experimentation, so many mushroom projects. So there's some real kind of energy out there, but also the collectivity that is being experienced, that I think is happening both within architects and designers themselves, but also how to connect to others. And I'm just gonna say that I love Jack's saying of architecture being frozen capital. That was really thoughtful, and I have a much longer way to say it, which is that architecture is resource and labor made formed through environment and culture, and that when we begin to think about who it then shapes, and to understand that we as architects usually just make the drawing and other people actually build it. What happens when the change is made that you didn't foresee? Who's the architect now? But that basically a recognition that architecture has also always been a much more broader and more inclusive field, and that by recognizing that it might actually give us even more. I'm going to use the word power, but you know what I mean, more impact is what I really mean in the built environment.
Yeah, I think to build on those points, I mean, we are existing in multiple layered crises at every scale you can think of today. And so kind of what I think is encouraging, or where I find hope and where I think the change can be made is in the actual organization and distribution of what architects do as offices, in the organization of their labor, and in the kind of creation of an institution, which is like an office or like a school or like a publication. And so the agency to be able to have a work environment that actually is healthy, to be able to support outside interests that will inevitably inform what you do as architects, and the ability to shape how you work as a team, and how you deal with problems as a team in terms of the often quite insane negotiations that go on to produce buildings, and the the orbits of decision-making that involve the architect and then oftentimes don't involve the architect. So I think I'm really enthusiastic about understanding and changing the way that we conduct ourselves and organize together. I think you see that in different ways that offices can be constituted, either across in different locations, in different sets of agency or decision making. And so I think the way that we create the system through which we design is a really powerful way that can improve the lives of architects and designers.
Really interesting that all of you are coalescing around the same issues, which yeah. Any questions? Oh, okay. You have questions. Interesting that 3 questions, well, 2 questions about publishing and newspapers. One to Quilian and to Jack. In the beginning of your pursuit as an architectural writer, did you ever feel nervous that the issue that you're addressing through your content might be categorized as irrelevant or non-important by the online community? And that's from Monil Shah. Relevance and understanding what, making judgments about importance of what you're taking on.
What you think about it?
Yeah, please.
Very quickly, I was wondering if any of you use a pseudonym at any point. Then it's related to that question.
It's funny, I did only an Art Connect in the early years because everyone did. So, and even people sometimes still name me Plus Q. That was there's a subtle messages sometimes get sent, but not because of writing, and just to address the question. Okay, so maybe because I was in that kind of early age of blogging, etc. There was a certain energy and excitement about these online spaces that maybe weren't as toxic as they have become. That maybe gave the opportunity to try things out and quite honestly not care as much. That there was, even though we did even use pseudonyms and ArtConnect stopped using them, I think in part to stop kind of certain bad behavior online. But even then, it was very different than what it has become now. And I'm putting myself in the shoes now that when everything that you put out gets scrutinized to a level that really can become paralyzing. I can see that point. For me, particularly, I have always, it was in a time when you could share it and there was the kind of larger vibe in the culture that was what people were doing. But also, I think also making sure that what you're writing, one person that has always been incredibly important for me to read, someone that I miss dearly, Michael Sorkin. Someone that could write with thought, with wit, with language that was understood by almost everyone, and always with a level of humanity that even if what Michael's saying you might not agree with, you appreciate with what was being said. And I think that if you go in with principles like that, no matter what you're talking about, like it could be quite honestly a subject no one cares about, but the way you're talking about it might give us a way in and a way of thinking about something that we might not have cared about before that might be interesting. So.
Yeah, it was funny to see the screenshot of ArtConnect because I remember like being having slow moments at work and just reading the ArtConnect forum as a way to like see what architects are talking about and kind of learning the personalities of the people that would post in there. Well, I'll start with your question. I have used a pseudonym, but it was in my high school newspaper, which I was also the editor of. And we didn't have enough writers. And so I wrote more under pseudonyms to be able to fill the newspaper at that point. But to the larger question of relevance, I think a skill that you can practice is the skill of observation and the skill of connecting objects and conditions to larger logistics and places. Like if someone asked you to write about this piece of glass that is, you know, the middle pane of glass in this opening here, it's not a very great assignment, but all of a sudden you could figure out where the glass comes from, why are the dots there, how tall is it, what supports the glass, and so you can unfold an environment even from small things. A better answer to that question is that as a writer, you often don't have to choose what you write about because you get assignments from editors. And so if you're a writer looking to practice, you can, you know, be in touch with the publication or talk to editors. And I do this all the time, nearly every day of the week, where where I figure out, okay, I'm interested in coverage of this, who should write about this? How can I find writers and match writers to things that they would be interested in? And so the avoided answer to the question is you write about what you're assigned to write about, and you start there.
So I'm going to combine two questions that are about getting jobs and moving on into your career. One of them says, as an international student pursuing a master's in architecture in the US, what should our approach be in regards to jobs and internships? And the other is from Khadija Kapan is, what advice would you give to someone who'd like to delve into the work of a publication or newspaper? So pretty practical questions for, you know, how do you get in, how do you move into the field?
Yes, and sadly for the first one, all I'll say is that not having had that issue myself, I don't always understand what's best. I know that there are, for example, a practice like the one I've had that where questions things and kind of very loose and can be harder under those conditions. I would love to actually to learn from that person more about some of the challenges and things that they're seeing. I think that that's important with our architectural education system now to be more aware of the challenges that international students face as they begin to look towards a practice of meaning.
Maybe I can try. Oh,
No, go ahead.
maybe I can chime in very briefly. Again, going along those lines of, you know, being a self-starter or trying to put yourself out there. Like I started being more successful when I stopped trying to be someone else. That very moment unlocked so many possibilities to me. And I think that as an international student applying to a job in the US, you need to show why your life experience is relevant to the practice. So many places are looking for that connection beyond, you know, the physical environment. And I think that instead of like keeping it to yourself and trying to blend in, actually that is going to find you the place that will respect you and will nourish your interests, not the other way around. So that would be my advice in that regard.
To the first question, I think it is true that the visa politics affects how people can live and work in the US, to put it like very abstract way. But I think even with friends who are in similar situations, I've been enthusiastic to see them find work in companies that sponsor visas and provide support for and recognize the value of having international teams. And so I think that's getting better as more conversations about healthier workplaces and workplace improvements continue. The other question is about getting involved in publications or anything. I think one thing that's a part of the history of architecture is that through the kind of restlessness of brains, that there's a great trajectory of student publications, of zines, of posters, of installations where students are able to, quite quickly create to create places where they can write together. I think a lot of schools now have student publications. Some schools even have the official publication and publication, thinking about Yale in particular with Perspecta and then Paprika as a kind of other place. The other thing is that if you're interested in writing, there are places that look for writers. I look for writers all the time, all over the country. And so a lot of publications do list the email addresses of their editors on their websites. And so you can be in touch if you have an idea, if you're looking to be involved. And there's a place for new writers and for new voices. Again, I would stress that it's not about having to have your ideas fully formed or have some kind of manifesto-like ambition, but it's about being open to using writing as a way to figure things out and being okay with the fact that you might not know a lot when you start, but you're going to know more when you turn in a draft. And through the process of communication through which you generate writing, you're going to grow and it's going to strengthen your intellect. I also think writing is an underappreciated tool for students. So like if you are able to write out what you're doing in your project and as you present and are able to articulate, I think using that to organize your ideas is a really strong thing to practice too.
Any questions in the room here? Yes. I'm going to repeat the question for the online audience. The question is there a future for newspapers given the presence and kind of omnipresence of social media? Will people read newspapers, or, I mean, is there a future?
I hope there's a future. I would say yes. I don't think the prevalence and the ubiquity of social media overrides the need for researched news and news that is important. It's true that the media landscape has been totally recontoured over the last 20 years, and so it's much harder for publications to survive. We've seen things fold. We've seen things be just online. You see increasingly both newspapers and publications about architecture owned by larger and larger companies, and so kind of folded into larger portfolios of income. But I think there's a real place still a real need for researched information. There's still a need to learn about what's going on in architecture that isn't just through an Instagram story. And so I think those are important places for documentation and conversation and critique even. But I do think that we need reliable places to produce stories and to generate information that we can count on. So it changes in different ways. I think the newspaper, the particular one that I work for right now, also does a lot of events. And so the model for how it can be sustainable can take other forms of production and knowledge sharing for architects into account.
Another online question. As a future architect, I'm interested in pursuing human empathetic design relating to the sensitivity of spaces, materials, color impacts, and most importantly, the human perception and psychology related to it. How should I move forward in that direction since it's an extremely niche sector? I would just say, wait, no, that's not niche. That's very, very central to architecture. But how would all of you respond to that question?
Yeah, I'll get started. That I agree with you. It's not a niche. I think number one is maybe you start going out and finding the social scientists, the people that want to work with you. If you're here in New York, the CUNY Graduate School has a PhD on environmental psychology and super interesting people that want to have these kind of conversations and that are always looking actually for designers. So in a funny way, like there are a lot of people that are anthropologists are beginning to create design anthropology departments. The social sciences are interested in this, and they're also aware that they don't know the ins and outs of the many things that you're talking about, and are looking for designers to partner with, for people to work with. So even at the student level, there's the same dynamic. Go and find folks that are doing this, that are looking at this, and find your own path. And I'll say this, that there's a, and we did this a lot in government actually. The evidence-based design guidelines. There's a series of these. There are a lot of new programs looking specifically at health and architecture. That is a big, is part of the EDS and MEDS model of economic growth in many cities. So now there's a lot more health programs are being opened within architecture school specializations where these kind of things are being looked at very seriously. What are the kind of things that are going to affect your life positively, and how does space play a role? I forgot the name of the organization that started the DDC under David Burney, the Center for Movement. They put out the guidelines. The active design.
Right.
Yeah, so look them up because they're doing this kind of research right now.
Either of you want to say?
Yeah, actually, I was going to mention the Center for Active Design, which is something that for a broader audience, it provides a toolkit in order to start, thinking about these issues in a more quantitative way, instead of just talking about what people call like these feelings. Like, no, there is science behind a lot of these emotions and perceptions of space, and we like to use science as really the scientific method to continue to test ideas in spaces, because thankfully we're still living in like a physical world, so we need to so far. So there are practices out there. The Center for Architecture, there's an AI committee that focuses on social sciences. So that will be a first place to stop by and learn more about what places nationally are working and under this set of parameters.
Any more? Yes, back in the back.
Louder.
You describe a moment maybe in your life where things were hard for you on this path, becoming architects and being where you are now. What was the response? How did you find a way to kind of keep pushing through? Because I could imagine this alternate universe where you're not architects, people might have given up on the dream. So how can we as aspiring architects continue to push forward on the paths that we are on? And when things get a little shaky, like what can we do to make the dream, keep the dream a reality?
So to repeat the question, it's asking each of the panelists if they could describe a difficult moment on their path and how they pushed through to keep going with their own dream of becoming an architect.
I think this is a little bit of a different answer than for the question that you asked, but I'm going to share with you that after the election in 2016, a lot of the institutions and organizations that were beginning to do very experimental, thoughtful work, that were beginning to go into the communities, stopped. The very election and even the change in the National Endowment for the Arts meant that a lot, at the time, I think I was working on two or three Art Town grants with different community groups across the country, from Ohio to Arizona to here in New York. So I think that was a moment in which the path that I was on, I had to question what was next because it seemed to be in true danger. Institutions up and down, even them not seeing it, had become more conservative, had become just more afraid of taking risks, more afraid of doing the things that they were doing before. And no one really said it, but you could see it. They were afraid of the way the NEA would give front grants, etc. That's personally what I, first of all, I would say having principles, values, the true north that you're following, whether honestly it's an architecture or not, is the important thing, I would say. But then for me, it was about trying to understand what kind of impact I wanted my work to have. And that's when I started taking, and that very election made me realize some of the things I was talking about, that perhaps thinking about government structures and the institutions that I had just seen kind of flip was the most important thing to do. That maybe it was a good moment to think about another way of practicing, another way of doing things. And that's when I joined the DDC, went to a community design center, and now I have to think about how these institutions that serve us generally, I mean, government is going to be there no matter who's there or not, right? But having people that can shape it and can work with it in interesting ways was what was important.
2016 was a disappointing year, but we have recovered and we're all here still with a lot of hope in the future. I want you to consider the fact that architecture is not a vehicle to a profession, but rather your language. That's really how you communicate. And that is going to open a lot of possibilities. We all have different upbringings and different paths that we have taken in our careers. And I think that we continue to shift, refocus, and change because we have embraced the fact that architecture is our language, design is our language, and how we manifest it, it could evolve, it could change with the years. I don't think any one of us is like established and we're set and this is what the way that we're gonna be practicing all time. And I'm gonna make a case also for public service. I think that what you're learning in school is critical thinking and the power of organization. And that is a skill that is limitless. Like you can do anything. And I think that in architecture school, there's a lot of focus on getting a job, getting your license, building a building, be the star of the show. And I think that there is a lot to be said about being the one organizing behind the scenes, being the one that is gathering everyone, because the tools that we have are really to serve the collective, not the individual.
Yeah, I think the previous question was about being interested in health in architecture, and I think part of this current question is about your own health and like well-being as a person, and I think that's super important to take seriously as when you're a student, and it's a very difficult, at times a very difficult degree and profession, and I think a certain amount of strenuousness is good to challenge you, but it's not good if it's unhealthy or not a good place to be. So I think taking your awareness of like your schedule and when you need to take breaks super seriously is really important. And I think the other thing that I'll share about this particular question is that I think we all kind of move along in life with ideas about what we want our careers to be like, what we want. We ideate futures, right? I mean, we do that professionally and we do that personally. And I guess, things can happen, opportunities can open where that idea of how you want to organize and continue in your life really change. And I guess the point there is that to be open to possibility as it even if it takes you in ways that you weren't previously expecting. And to other to echo other points here, that we need, even if, some of you and some of us might not, end up being practicing architects, the idea of what practicing means and what, where you serve and where you do your work. I think having a really expansive understanding of how you can be interested in architecture and doing work in the government, which is totally underappreciated and super important in nonprofits, and in I think banks have a lot of control over architecture, and not a lot of people in banks seem to, anyways. So I think there are places where you can find your agency in lots of different ways, and sometimes you get there in circuitous ways.
Maybe time for one last question. Yes.
I've seen throughout my year, school, you don't really compete with it, but we build. So how do we tackle this?
So the question to summarize is, how is real knowledge and communication with a community established and brought back into school? Is that, I mean, it's not exactly how you said it, but the questioner says that in school we're building, or architects in general, I guess, are building in communities but not really understanding communities. Is that what you're? Yeah, how do you authentically and genuinely engage with communities?
I guess this is a school question. I'll begin. I think that first of all, it's a great question, and I want to put this point clear to everyone here, because I think it's important for you. Is that these questions have been asked in the past. I recently moderated a conversation about the state of architectural education, curricular change, and I ended with a transcript of the 1968 Pratt student strike and their demands. What you just said was a demand in 1968. And it's interesting because different schools have taken, and even different programs within Pratt, with people, faculty now that are the most senior faculty we have, who were students striking then. And one case, we have the GCP, the Graduate Center for the Planning and the Environment, which has an incredibly robust community engagement track record for decades. It's nothing new to them. They've been doing it. The Pratt Center comes out of those interests and those issues. And someone that worked in community design centers, I would say that actually community design centers have a lot to add to this conversation. I'm also going to share with you that sometimes, and I think it's also how we do it, I'm saying it this way to let you know that both I think is incredibly important. As you can see, my practice in all levels has been around these issues, but that it also it has to be done somewhat carefully, both for the community's sake, because sometimes when they're engaged for certain things, people get excited. And there are communities that are tired of being engaged. You go to Red Hook one more time to think about the future of NYCHA, and people are gonna be like, again? And not that can't be overcome. Again, there are programs that have established ongoing, long-lasting relationships. It's just that sometimes academics calendars kind of get in. So there are things to be weighed here, which is the education of your education, the fact that you're here for a finite, or schools for a finite period of time, the fact that communities have to live with ideas, thoughts for long time periods of time, so that there's a balance. On the other hand, this is incredibly important. There are structures and people that have tried it right now at the School of Architecture at Pratt. For example, we're inviting architects with expertise on this, and I will put myself in that category, that to come and be fellows and work with students in different years and find the ways that work well for whatever the project is and the community is. Again, as part of a long-term relationship with this community, not a one-time drop in, what do you think? Okay, here it is, move out. That has to be rethought completely, because that can be honestly even worse than not talking to people at all. And I see this need and desire also in other places. School of Art, School of Design at Pratt also, but also in other places I have seen are beginning to bring more people that are having larger practices to think about these set of issues and that are creating pedagogic models that make sense for the students and make sense for the communities.
I think you want to say.
Try to be very brief. There was a strike also at Columbia when there was a gym. I think it was in '68 as well. The university wanted to build a gym in Harlem, and obviously everyone was very upset about it. You should go find about it. I think that maybe a way to bridge the practice with the academia is that there are practices, there are studios, there's people that are working to listen first and execute later. If you don't listen, then you really don't know what the issues are because you're not in the community. It would be better if we collaborate directly with the community, shoulder to shoulder. We are the ones that can communicate the idea at the end, the product, but really they're the ones that are writing the program. I wonder if there's any opportunity in academia to have a studio, which it's more likely than not, but also have like a seminar that talks about providing the tools for students and for future practitioners to actually do proper community engagement and to really have find a methodology to memorialize what the program of the community is, what actually they need, and not just, you know, at the end of like some installation, take pictures and you know, put it on your social media and move on. It needs to be permanent. It needs to leave a trace of action.
I think, too, I hope there's a little bit of time after we formally close for you to mingle a bit with the speakers and ask questions too. But I just want to thank you, all three of you, for excellent presentations and really thoughtful answers to the questions. And thank you very much.